Hi, I'm Eugene Ughetti and I'm the co-artistic director of Speak Percussion. Speak Percussion is a group I formed as a student 25 years ago, and I've been lucky enough to build my whole artistic practice through the work of this company over the last quarter century. My role, aside from being artistic director, has been to be a performer, a percussionist, a composer, a curator, a collaborator, and even a producer across all of this time. And today I'm going to speak to you about what I've learnt across this period of time. In particular, my philosophy of musical instruments. What I understood about musical instruments when Speak Percussion began is very different to what I understand now. My perspective has changed, and my relationship and philosophy to musical instruments is really critical to how I make music and how I regard success in a musical composition. Now, this is relevant for anyone who plays music. You don't need to be a percussionist. Anybody who composes music, anybody who makes instruments or has a collection of instruments and performs with them in different ways. So I think there's a really broad relevance to how this kind of information might help you in what you do. I started young, like most of us. Santa Claus gave me a practice pad and drumsticks. And from there, I studied the drum set, all kinds of styles of music, and eventually moved into concert band and symphony orchestra music. So I studied compositions of composers from across the globe, mostly European ones, I have to say. And then eventually started collaborating more, making my own compositions, working with other contemporary composers, and really pushing forward the idea of what contemporary music can look like. But it's spanned everything from grunge, rock, and Latin, all the way through to highly experimental and avant-garde forms. When I started music, I thought of musical instruments as objects, stuff that you could buy in a shop. Funnily enough, my dad owned a music store, and so most school holidays, or if I was sick at home from school, I'd get dragged into the shop and I'd get to play around with things. These objects, in a way, were typified by this awesome keyboard that came out in the middle of the 80s. Which is when I was a kid. The Casio keyboard. There was this model that suddenly had all of these amazing percussion samples, everything from orchestral instruments and drum kits all the way through to sound effects like gunshots and hand claps. This is how I think the world thought of percussion, as a library of samples. Even in the symphony orchestra, hundreds of years ago, composers were using the triangle as a little shimmer of color or just something that was added to the composition rather than being the heart and the soul of the composition itself. I was looking for something more. I wanted to have a deeper relationship with instruments, and I wanted to feel like I could have a big expressive palette. What I've realized is that percussion instruments, or any musical instrument, is not really an object. A musical instrument only comes to life when it's being enacted. In other words, when it's changing, producing sound, being manipulated by a performer or by some other system. It has to be active, it has to be changing for it to be a musical instrument. Similarly, musical instruments carry a lot of knowledge, history, culture, references in them. Some of them, digital instruments, might reference dance music, they might reference a particular way of composing. Other instruments can be sacred. Maybe they belong to a religious practice or some kind of ritual. Some other instruments are from specific countries, like the marimba is the national instrument of Guatemala, for example. Each instrument carries its own history and its own context. And this is really important for us when we work with instruments. But finally, musical instruments have agency. They enact agency, I should say. So when we perform them, we can't just do what we want with them. We can't just use them. A lot of people think they can, but in fact, instruments push back. If we play too hard, too loud, we can break them. If we're too gentle, they don't sound at all, or perhaps they sound feeble. They respond to us. And they don't just respond through sound and the production of sound. Even though a musical instrument probably is there for the purposes of making music, it's there doing other stuff. It's like thinking of me as a musician. That's not my entire life, even though it feels like that sometimes. I'm here on this earth doing a whole range of other things. And I think musical instruments are very similar. When we think about the marimba, to go back to that example, some of the most prized wood that you can use is African rosewood or padauk. This is an endangered kind of product now. It's environmentally almost unsustainable or questionable as to whether you'd want to cut down rosewood trees and dry them into marimba bars. So we've got ethical and environmental things to decide as well. So what I've learned in 25 years of making music with Speak Percussion is a fairly unique perspective on what musical instruments are. This might sound a little bit technical, but in the second episode, I'm going to explain what this really means. For me, a musical instrument involves three things happening at the same time. They can't be separated. If they are separated, then it's not a musical instrument. So for me, a musical instrument is a material, it's semiotic, so I'll explain that, and it's a practice. So the practice is the doing, it's the kind of movement, it's the sound making and the kind of changes over time. The material is the physical object, the form, the structure of the sounding body, but that also includes the human body, especially if you're a singer. And the semiotics can mean lots of things, but essentially it's all the stuff that the instrument is referring to or pointing to or symbolizing. So a good example of a musical instrument and its semiotics is music. If you see a trumpet, we think of a bugle call, or we think of the races, or we think of a loud, brassy kind of sound. These are all things that the instrument points to and produces. But similarly, when we think of a trumpet, we think of metal and bent pistons and a mouthpiece, and we think of maybe even a exclamatory kind of musical statement. So that's what I mean by semiotics. We'll get into that in greater detail in the next episode, but I'd just like to say, for anyone, irrespective of the kind of music, this is going to be useful if you want to find new ways of working with instruments that you've already worked with in the past, or perhaps you're wanting to deepen your compositional and performance practice. And this will allow you to find new ways of making work and to think in a slightly different way about where your work can go.